The whole idea was to keep the car as its optimum height above the ground so that it was always producing the maximum amount of downforce. With conventional springs, as soon as you hit the brakes, there's weight transfer forward and the front goes down and the back goes up, which changes the balance of the car. And as soon as you pick up the throttle in the middle of the corner, the back goes down and the front comes up, which changes the balance of the car. And if you could have an active suspension system which was fast enough acting to compensate for that, and also, even more important, held the car regardless of whether it was a low-speed corner with not much downforce or a high-speed corner with just a huge amount of downforce, you still have the car optimum height above the ground. That was the objective of the active suspension, and it is worth seconds a lap, not tenths, seconds.
Active suspension was banned for the 1994 season. To the engineers, this seemed unfair. Previous bans had been imposed on the grounds of safety. Active suspension, clearly one technical idea that could apply to road cars, was banned because it was a driver aid.
I don't think that the active suspension itself was a driver aid. It didn't actually drive the car for the driver. It raised the performance potential of the car, but it was a very, very interesting technology which I think could have many commercial uses as well, and I think it was rather a pity that Formula One jumped on that one to limit it.
They saw it as restricting the role of the driver and turning the driver into a kind of robot, if you like. I mean, that's an extreme image. So there is an argument of a sort of driver versus technological aids, or drivers versus the cutting edge of technology. That's not a simple question, because which direction do you move in? And the sport is kind of trying to work out where to go between the two.
Engineers are so good at making up for lost ground, regardless of what limitation is placed on them, that the car would then exceed the speed that the circuit was built for. And that is a given mathematical fact. It would happen. There are corners all around the world that would become unusable if the cars were not controlled in the way they use their wings and the aerodynamics and the power of the engine and the traction and everything else.
Even with no skirts, no turbos and no active suspension, a modern Formula One car can generate enough speed and downforce to easily overcome its own weight. It could race on the roof of a tunnel with ease.
The restrictiveness of the rules does force one to be ever more creative. It does drive you to think of every single way you can think of to find a legal loophole in the regulation which you can exploit and make your car quicker. And if it's permitted, everyone else will charge with the same gap as well. So you have to think of something else, and that's part of the fun.
The minute a racing car hits the road, the designer of that car, the man whose signature's at the bottom, will be thinking like an artist, I want to get on with the next painting or the next car, because I know this isn't right or that isn't right, and if we can get the engine supplier to do this, then I know I can do that. So it's just constant change all the time.
And if a car that can defeat gravity is the result, it isn't surprising. The source for most of the technology is aircraft.
Think of aerospace. Aerospace is about aerodynamics. It's also about being very creative about materials. Making it as light as possible, making it as strong as possible, making it operate in extreme conditions. That's nothing to do with road car manufacture, really. Likewise, motor racing is exactly like that. You know, how can you make that car as light as possible? As light as possible. And how can you make that suspension at the same time as strong as possible, hence the whole use of carbon fibre and so on. So those kind of skills around materials, around aerodynamics, is an example of how the industries interact.
There are some requirements for a Formula One car that are common with, say, a high-performance fighter aircraft. You want very lightweight, high level of structural integrity within a small volume, a very high engine power and systems packed within this very small space, very high aerodynamic performance, very high aerodynamic efficiency. All these things tend to lead to the design thinking having certain common aspects between the two, and in truth some of the materials employed, whether they were, say, aluminium alloys or titaniums, and some of the bonding and joining techniques, and more recently within the last 20 years composites a lot to increase structural integrity, reduce weight.
This is nothing new. Racing car design has always stolen ideas from aircraft. And sometimes aircraft have secretly stolen from cars. From the skirted cars of the late 70s to the active suspension cars of the early 90s, Formula One engineers have become increasingly secretive about their technology. By the time this car was banned in 1993, Formula One drivers had a skilled secret assistant on board, a powerful computer. Everything from the spark that ignited the fuel in the engine to the split-second decision to change gear was controlled by an electronic brain. The parallels to aircraft design were obvious, not just in the winged profile of the modern Formula One car, but in the electronic revolution taking place in the cockpit. Something had to be done.
It was decided that all those driver aids should come off because the emphasis should be on the drivers' championship. So all the driver aids came off. There was one alternative, and that was to say that the FIA would issue standard electronic control units which would be given out for every engine, but eventually they decided that the car companies would be frightened away because it would effectively cut across their technology.
And for the first time since the 1930s, the car companies were coming back to Formula One, precisely because of its high-tech profile. And the powerful auto giants know the lessons of history. Technology will always win. Aircraft and reliable cars were born at the beginning of the 20th century. By the time planes looked like this in the 1930s, the same engineers were often working on both. Men like Richard Shuttleworth saw planes and racing cars as opportunities to develop and share technology. In 1935, he raced a supercharged Alfa Romeo through the murk of an English summer at Castle Donington. He won the race. Shuttleworth's legacy is a world-famous collection of aircraft. These planes, perhaps the Eurofighters of their day, look quaint now, but at the time offered inspiration for racing car designers.
In the aircraft industry, because strength plus flexibility, there's a very high premium on those qualities.